Hello, AWP 2026 Baltimore. I hope you had a wonderful conference. Welcome. Well, most of you are probably going home, and then I have to go home to my lonely place again too. So, no more writers around like now. I am Demisty Bellinger. I am a member of the board of directors here at AWP. I am a Black woman, a very tall 5'2". I have two French braids, and I'm wearing a black and brown and white dress. And I am here to introduce this wonderful panel. The Association of Writers and Writing Programs is a small but mighty nonprofit organization that amplifies the voices of writers and the academic programs and organizations that serve them, all while championing diversity and excellence in creative writing. I am a member of AWP's board of directors, but first and foremost, I am a member of AWP. I am a member because I myself am a writer. Hopefully you bought one of my books in the book fair. I am also a teacher of writers, and I want to support young people and older people who are now just embarking on their writing careers. We are delighted to bring you the event today. Oh, I'm sorry, I should say, if you're not a member, do become a member. If you can, please donate to AWP. We are delighted to bring you to this event today. I'd like to acknowledge and thank, who is it Penn? No, the Pulitzer for sponsoring this event and their support of the conference. Our literary partners and sponsors allow AWP to present these extraordinary literary events and help us keep our conference affordable and accessible. I have just a few quick reminders before the event. Respect seats marked for attendees with accessibility needs. They're very clearly marked in the front. Please give the authors about 10 minutes after the presentation to get to the book signing table before approaching them to have your book signed. There will be a table where you can buy the books, and then there's a table where you can get the book signed. And thank you. Now it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Marjorie Miller, who will introduce this fantastic event. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you all for coming to this. I'm Marjorie Miller. I'm the administrator of the Pulitzer Prizes. And we are very excited to be here at AWP in Baltimore. We've never participated in AWP before, so this is really, we're impressed. We hear there's like 10,000 people here at this amazing program and book fair. And I think we'll come back. I think we'll do that. Yeah. So thank you for welcoming us. This is part of our relatively new Pulitzer on the Road program, and I want to thank AWP and Colleen Cable and all her associates for welcoming us into it and helping us participate. This is a program where we celebrate winners and finalists of the Pulitzer Prizes. And we give out 23 prizes a year in journalism, in books, drama, and music. And these are symbols of excellence in these fields. And they portray shared experiences, they hold power to account, and they expand our understanding of one another. That's how you win a Pulitzer Prize. So this initiative is to take winners and finalists around the country in events to give new life to some of the work and to bring the work to people who may not always have access to these wonderful authors and journalists and musicians, and to also explain or demonstrate the importance of journalism and these arts in our democracy and civil society and why they're important. And in October, we're beginning, we do events. We have a podcast, which you can get to on our site. And we're starting a traveling exhibition in October with the American Libraries Association that will go into libraries around the country. And you can read more about that when we actually announce it, which we actually haven't. So, but that'll start in October. So I am so happy to have Natasha and Lucy at this event. I admire them and their work. Natasha is a 2007 Pulitzer Prize winner for poetry, and she also serves on the board with me, which is just a delight to have her there. She has served 2 terms as the U.S. Poet Laureate from 2012 to 2014, and she's the author of 5 poetry collections, including Native Guard, for which she won the Pulitzer Prize, a book of nonfiction, Beyond Katrina, a meditation on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and then a New York Times bestselling memoir, Memorial Drive, that came out in 2020. And these guys are so prolific that I have to write it all down. The House of Being in 2024, a meditation on writing. She has received many fellowships and awards. She's a Chancellor Emeritus of the Academy of American Poets and has served on the board of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's a Board of Trustees professor of English at Northwestern University. So please welcome Natasha. Lucy Sante is an author and cultural critic and the author of 10 books, including Low Life, Evidence, The Factory of Facts, Kill All Your Darlings, Folk Photography, The Other Paris, Maybe the People Would Be the Times, and 19 Reservoirs. Her memoir, I Heard Her Call My Name, was a Pulitzer finalist last year. And it was named a Best Book of the Year by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Slate. Lucy's been awarded a Whiting Writers Award, an award in literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a Grammy Award. We don't have too many of those. You and Kendrick, I think. An Infinity Award from the International Center of Photography, and Guggenheim and Cullman Center fellowships. She just recently retired after 24 years of teaching at Bard College. So please welcome Lucy. So they will be speaking in conversation with each other for about an hour, and then there's, as they said, there will be a book signing outside. And if you want to know any more about the Pulitzer Prizes, I will be out there with my colleague Pamela, and we can talk to you about how to enter for a Pulitzer Prize. So thank you very much.
Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Natasha Trethewey, and for those of you who've not read Lucy's gorgeous memoir, I Heard Her Call My Name, a memoir of transition, I want to tell you a little bit about it. Revisiting her past through the lens of her present, Lucy tells a moving story of metamorphosis and the years of thinking and feeling that preceded it. She reflects on her years of gender dysphoria alongside other sources of unhappiness, unease, and discontent rooted in self-doubt, her parents' class anxieties, immigrant experience, and the residue of her Catholic upbringing. A significant thread pulled through I Heard Her Call My Name begins with an app. Lucy uses a face app that can take a photo and give back a different gender. In Lucy's case, showing her an aspect of her true self, the woman she has always felt herself to be, the life she could have been living, even before she was able to merge the inner self with the outer. The transformation of her appearance in the photos the app gives back is akin to looking in a mirror and finally seeing your inner self reflected there. It also spoke to me as a memoir of aging. Lucy transitions later in life at the same time that mirrors begin to give back images that don't necessarily coincide with how we see ourselves, the younger selves still inside us. From the beginning, I was struck by the intimacy of the voice, the kinship it created. It was as if I was reading things about myself. So similar were a lot of our experiences. It's a compelling journey of selfhood and of becoming, and it taught me things that connected me to my own very different experience of becoming. Growing up mixed race Black girl in Mississippi and Georgia in the 60s and 70s and 80s, I had a kind of double consciousness. I wanted to be seen for who I was on the inside, the content of my character, in a time and place entrenched in troubling ideas about race, a place where most white people, including my beloved father, harbored or could not fully unyoke themselves from deeply ingrained and unexamined notions of racial difference and hierarchy, which meant that they saw me through that lens, based on their perceptions of Blacks, of women, a cause of some of my own childhood dysphoria. Beyond the immediately compelling voice and elegant prose, I love this book because it made me think about the nature of being. To what extent and at what point do we truly know ourselves? How many transformations do we undergo throughout our lives? What parts of who we are do we keep hidden? What is the role of denial in the creation of the self? What mask do we wear, and who might we become if we allow the mask to slip? How many of us find, as Lucy puts it, proof of an essential truth about the self, wherein self-doubt falls away? Lucy, I'm so delighted to be here with you, and I'm wondering if you would start us off by reading a passage from this book.
Sure. Thank you, Natasha. That was lovely. Well, I've always found this book hard to read from because it's just not written to be read from aloud, I think, maybe. Anyway, I found a new section, so I've never read this aloud except on the audiobook, and we'll see how it goes. For months, I was preoccupied with the matter of my name. I knew perfectly well that my name was Lucy. Over the decades, I had occasionally toyed with alternate names. I liked Louise, Betty, Julie, Colette, Simone, Florence. I thought of just dropping my first name in favor of my middle name assigned at birth, Marie. But Lucy stuck. It had nothing to do with any Lucys I had met, but went straight back to my appearance as Lucy in a in a picture caption typo in a small suburban gazette when I was 12. The name had taken root in my brain and defeated all comers. That wasn't the problem. What concerned me was my byline. I'd been chatting on the phone with Jamie, a painter and filmmaker I'd known for 40 years and who had transitioned a few years before me. She told me that her gallery had decided that her work would have to keep being exhibited and sold under the name James, since a mid-career switch would confuse the market. The decision was rescinded a bit later, but before I was aware of that, I fretted for months over whether I should do the same. I asked everybody I knew for their opinion. I thought of the strange attributions one sometimes found on detective novels. John Creasy writing as Michael Halliday. In my notebook, I even wrote out a speculative opening for my memoir, should I ever write one. This book is by Luc Sante, although it was written by Lucy Sante. I wasn't so much worried about the market and its possible confusions as I was worried about the continuity of my writing, by which I really meant the continuity of myself. A one-letter alteration might at worst make people think the byline belonged to a close relative. Maybe. My family name, which does not mean health, and in fact is not even French, it's Walloon, and it comes from the Walloon for Alexander. It's extremely rare, and all bearers of it, unless they change to it from some less wieldy name, another language, can trace their ancestry back to my hometown. As far as I've been able to determine, I'm the only person in the world to bear either my current or my former name, so nobody would remain confused for long. My own confusion had more to do with the arbitrary line between public and private selves. I published my first professional piece of writing in the New York Review of Books in 1981 when I was 27. I'd been writing since I was a child and had published poems and stories in little magazines since my teens. But suddenly being paid for writing was something else again. It was an actual profession, and I had to learn its protocols. My first 10 years were an apprenticeship. I published various kinds of literary journalism in magazines and newspapers and rigorously avoided the word I. The act was something of an impersonation. I was playing a character more worldly and sophisticated than I actually was. So I had to keep my real self tightly buttoned up. Parens, when I first began submitting work, fruitlessly, to Rolling Stone and other magazines when I was 14, I made sure to sign the cover letter, Mr. Luc Sante, so they'd know I was both male and adult. Naturally, I was all but overcome by imposter syndrome. Even when I did start writing about aspects of my own life, I was careful to keep the rest curtained off. So I just had cataract surgery, so my eyesight is a little weird right now. In the late 1990s, I published A Factory of Facts, an actual memoir, although I tried to absent myself from the story, or at most to depict myself as a squiggle on an architectural elevation. I wanted to show my whole background, presenting the history of my family, the history of my native town, the history of Belgium, the history of Belgian emigration, and so on. But actually rendering my own face and my own emotion would, I claimed, reduce and standardize the narrative. I thought this demurral was a measure of my seriousness. But of course I was dodging self-depiction because I didn't want to be seen. And I didn't want to be seen because I didn't know who I was. I don't know how much I let myself be aware that the duality of nationalities and cultures mirrored another duality within. But I'm sure I never surmised that metamorphosis would be something I'd experienced more than once. Right up until my egg cracked, I continued to maintain the fiction that my writing self was somehow distinct from the rest of me. It went along with the sense that I had in my social life that I was always playing a role, the effort of which left me exhausted at the end of every night. Out. I mostly failed to connect those two phenomena, however, and of course I was unable to see what connected them. Somehow or other, I managed to avoid considering the possible long-term side effects of carrying around a secret the size of a house. I pretended to myself that what I was trying to conceal was my inferiority to the character I tried to create in writing and in life. I was boring, clumsy, nebbishy, unsexy, squirrely, pedantic, useless, feeble, no fun, eternally on the B and even the C list of even my closest friends. To be sure, this self-portrait was not strictly a byproduct of gender dysphoria. My parents' class anxieties, the immigrant experience, and the residue of a Catholic upbringing contributed as well. My secret poisoned my entire experience of life. There was never a moment when I didn't feel this acute shame of being me, even as I denied to myself that my secret had anything to do with it. I might feel proud of things I'd done, might even be able to summon the will to entertain ambitions, and might ascribe such things to an idealized self I sometimes try to make myself believe in. But eventually I was going to catch sight of myself in a mirror, and that would destroy me for an hour or a day or a week. I've been almost continuously in therapy for 38 years, but because I was guarding my secret, even in the therapist's office, no diagnosis ever came close to identifying the cause. At some point in the relatively recent past, I came upon a citation from the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas. If you bring forth what is within you, what is within you will destroy. Wait a minute. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you will destroy you. That was an even more effective scare than the line I remembered from William Blake's Proverbs of Hell. Sooner murder an infant in its cradle than nurse unacted desires. It reminded me of the notion popular in the 60s and 70s that major diseases were caused by festering repression. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you.
And I have to show you this because this is part of what you just read, and it was part of what I would have asked you to read if you had not already done so. You brought up so many things that I wanted to start asking you about, but since you mention, well, two things. There's a moment early on that you say when you were practicing what if you ever wrote a memoir, it would be Luc Sante, written by Lucy Sante. So at that point, you're thinking, if you ever write one, but of course, later on, you do call The Factory of Facts an actual memoir. And I want to talk a little bit with you about beginnings and also about the impulse to actually write a memoir. Now, I had to teach a class once, a graduate course on life writing is what I called it. And I think you and I both have a little bit of anxiety around whether we use the term memoir. But I was calling it life writing, but it was a class, prose. I'd never done this before, never taken a class like that myself. So I decided to focus on beginnings. And the first thing I had my students read was the beginning of The Factory of Facts. And I asked them to do this prompt. The prompt was and these are things that came up because of the book. I wanted them to write several paragraphs, and each one was a factual origin story, a counterfactual origin story, an origin story that might have been but for some random occurrence that changed the course of history, an origin story you have fantasized about or wished for instead of your actual origins, an origin story that is factual but focuses on and highlights different elements of the story, a true origin story that is not necessarily factual. This book makes me think about all of those things, The Factory of Facts, because in the opening chapter resume, each paragraph begins the same way with some version of these words. I was born on May 25th, 1954, in Verviers, Belgium, the only child of Lucien and Denise Sante, following the bankruptcy of my father's employer, an iron foundry that manufactured wool carding machinery. But each paragraph tells a drastically different origin story. And what interested me about this beginning is the way that it establishes the speaker as either a fabulist, an unreliable narrator, or someone very much wanting to create a version of the self based on which particular story is told, assuming that each one has some kernel of truth in it. And what echoes the idea of the factory of facts, the idea of invention, the way a writer chooses the particular details while leaving out others in order to tell a particular story. So I'm wondering, after all of that I just said, can you talk a little bit about the idea behind those beginnings in the Factory of Facts before we move back to the beginnings in this one?
Oh, sure. So I set out to write this book about, where I come from, how my immigration story, but all the weird things about it. And I had no idea how to start. And I took a nap, and I woke up in this kind of dizzy state. And I was writing something completely different at the time on the side. And I was very, very much fascinated by the notion of the folk lyric. That is, these lines that exist in songs, in blues and country and folk, that just drift from song to song. You know, I play cards in England, I play cards in France, all these kind of lines that have been around, some of them since the Middle Ages. And at the same time, I was remembering an assignment that Kenneth Koch, my poetry teacher at Columbia, gave us once, which was to write a boasting poem. And somehow these two ideas merged, but their offspring was something very different. And each of those 9 versions of the tale, of which the first one is correct and the 8 others are fictional, but what they do is, and you know, I can't claim responsibility for this. This was my subconscious that arranged all this. It turns out that it chooses our immigration to the United States as a pivot, and then all the other variations represent hopes and primarily fears that were ambient. I was too young at the time to have my own thoughts about the subject, but these are things that I felt reflected off my parents. I kind of gave voice to my parents' worst nightmares and a couple of their fantasies.
And you come back in I Heard Her Call My Name and almost use that same opening again. I was born in 19, again, but then tell another version that we'd not even seen before. So can you talk a little bit about that, about writing more than one metamorphosis story?
Right. Well, you know, it's been spooky. I mean, through this whole process, thinking about passing, for example. I mean, I shouldn't be concerned with that at my ancient age, but I do, because we're human. And I remember how my childhood was spent passing. I mean, when we first came to the United States when I was not quite 5, but then we went back and forth, and then, you know, finally settled here when I was around like 8. And right away, I mean, I started American school not knowing a word of English. The nun told me that it was hot and I should take off my sweater. I didn't understand. And she started taking off my sweater, and I only had a shirt collar dickie underneath. You know, it was like all these misunderstandings. And then it felt like, and in some ways, you know, even at my advanced age, it sometimes still feels like I'm trying to figure out how the Americans behave and behave accordingly. Because, you know, we were immigrants who did not move into like an immigrant community. There were no other immigrants, and there were certainly no Belgian immigrants. I met like 3 or something. So we were completely surrounded by Americans, and everybody I saw, whatever race they were, wherever they came from originally, to us, they were Americans, all of them. So, you know, very equal vision. But, you know, I was always measuring myself against that. There were those nuances I would never get. And as I was transitioning, these parallels, which are not quite exact, of course, they mean different things, but there was still a kind of habit of thought that just carried over. And it was just, I don't know, it was like this revenant, or, you know, it made me feel like my whole experience of life was really coming into, well, I mean, everybody comes into the world naked and learns how to adapt, but I came into the world naked twice and had to figure it all out by myself. You know, my parents were no help, and even though I didn't, they've been dead for a while now, but they would not have been a help in this transition either. I didn't have a rule book. I just had to invent.
You know, you mentioned passing, and that's another one of those things that I feel like we have in common. My first poems, when I decided that I was going to write poetry were actually about passing, trying to, and the kind of shame that I felt about it. This poem has not survived. We talk about the things we write that don't survive, but there was a poem. My first poem was called One of Them, and it was about the experience of when I started 8th grade at a new school. It was the high school, and my grandmother had come up from Mississippi because this was, exciting, starting the new school. And she and my mother drove me to the school on the weekend for the orientation. And this was a school that I was being bused into. In Atlanta, we still had this busing program called M to M, and it was majority to minority. So if you lived in a neighborhood where your race was in the majority, you could choose to be bused to one where you were in the minority. And a lot of kids from my neighborhood chose this white school simply because it had better resources. It was brand new. And so we drive up to the school, and I jump out of the car, and I run in, trying to put distance between me and my grandmother and my mother, thinking that I'll go into this new school and they won't know what I am. It was a tremendous source of shame, and it took me a long time to get over that, and trying to write about it in the very beginning. It's a thing that I have not returned to in quite the same way in poetry, but it is a thing that I will return to now that I'm at work on another memoir. Now that is a different story that I will tell than my previous memoir, Memorial Drive. So, beginnings. I heard her call my name. You begin with the text of an email attachment that you send to your closest friends. It was about your moment of reckoning that was set off by that face app that you did, and you called it Lucy. When you were writing that letter, I'm assuming that that's the first writing that you did about the transition or about deciding. But did you know at that moment that you were going to write a memoir? Or at what point did you decide that?
No, I did not. Actually, the thing is one thing in the book, if you haven't seen it, is it's interspersed with photographs. I did childhood photographs of these other photographs, because really what cracked my egg was passing photographs from the entirety of my life, really, through this thing called Face App, where you could change genders photographically. I realize it's an AI tool, probably. But anyway, when I was doing this, my first thought wasn't even, holy shit, that's me. My first thought was, wow, I've got to make a book of these photographs. Before I thought of writing a memoir, I thought the photo part of me thought this. And then when I realized this was going to be a memoir, in the summer of, when was it? Summer of 2022, I realized I was going to write this memoir. And I wrote a first chapter that was all apologetics. It was all, well, I know I'm old and I know that I'm imperfect and, I'm not in step with the youthful trans community and on and on and on and on. And I showed it to my friend Daryl Pinkney, who I've good friend for 53 years now, my first reader for a long time. And he said, forget about it. Just print that letter he sent to everybody. And I thought, wow, I almost didn't do it because it felt so raw. That was a communication. It's not writing. How can I begin a book with something that's not writing? But I did. He was right. It was the perfect preamble. It told the whole story right there. And, and there are things that I kind of wish weren't in there because they're kind of ugh or cringe or something, but you know, I had to be true. So
Okay, so you'd written this whole other part, the one that Daryl said
yeah,
no.
yeah.
Okay. Did you think that that was the beginning? Did you think that that's where the memoir was going to begin? Or were you just writing? I guess what I'm trying to ask is, so I'm one of those people who I can't sort of proceed with writing a memoir. Or even, you know, when I was in school, I couldn't proceed with writing an essay or a paper unless I had the beginning. Because the beginning for me just sort of created a little bit of a map. Even though I didn't know exactly where I was going to
Yeah.
end up, it still told me that.
Yeah,
Are
yeah.
you like that? Or can you just write the middle and
Oh, no,
figure
no,
it
no,
out?
no. I have to write from top left corner to bottom right corner.
Okay.
Absolutely. And, you know, this was, well, I mean, I realize now, you know, or I realized soon after that it was just clearing my throat. But I had to get all my primary anxieties out of the way. And I had to write them, you know, probably ritualistic. And if I'd been writing on paper, I would have ceremonially burned them in an ashtray, you know, that kind of thing. It just, I had to write it and, you know, then no longer worry about it for the rest of it. And then, you know, this, again, this letter was, I would not have known how to begin it otherwise, really.
Right, right. Well, having never taken classes in, you know, trying to write memoir, I realized that when I did it, and even now as I'm trying to do it, I'm teaching myself how to do it, you know,
Yeah.
every time. And one of the things that was most useful to me in writing Memorial Drive was Vivian Gornick's The Situation and the Story. I mean, it was there that I learned something about the necessity for creating of the self a character, because that character was going to be responding to everything. And so who was I? What was this character going to be? And the other thing that has stayed with me is this. She writes, every work of literature has both a situation and a story. The situation is the context or the circumstance, sometimes the plot. The story is the emotional experience that preoccupies the writer, the insight, the wisdom, the thing one has come to say. It was easy for me, after I read that, to make 2 columns on a sheet of paper, and in one column, I wrote the situation. And the situation for me was growing up in a household of domestic violence, escaping it, then losing my mother to it despite our attempts to get away. But I had no idea of the story that I was going to tell. That was the hardest part, because the story isn't just the chronology of those events. And so trying to figure out that beginning did show me a kind of direction that I could follow. What about in your email that became your beginning? How did it show you where you were going, what your story was going to be?
Well, yeah, like you, I didn't really know until I was writing. And, you know, what I did was, it was a matter of engineering, really, because I had realized I had 2 timelines, which was A, the first 6 months of my transition, and B, the whole entire panorama of my life. And so that's like, and I did like think like, well, should I tell the transition story first and go back into my life? No, the obvious thing was to interleave them. And that turned out to be, and you know, one thing I've learned from the surrealists, among other people, is the importance of constraints and the importance of using mechanical means to keep the conscious mind playing a game, So, it's like the cops in your head are so busy playing Skittles that your unconscious mind can travel around untrammeled. So it became a matter of interleaving alternate chapters, and at a certain point, actually part way through the book, it becomes that every one of these sections, because the book doesn't have chapters, it just has sections, every one of those had to be 7 pages of typescript. And that means, I know, like, ding, a bell went off and I'd go switch tracks. But the other great thing is that 7 pages meant that when I was writing about my past, I had to compress furiously. When I was writing about those first 6 months, I had to expand furiously. And that gave it a dynamic right there. And, again, this is a gift from the unconscious,
Which you trust very much.
Totally.
Yes.
It's, it's my spirit animal, my subconscious.
Yeah, right, right. So, are there other personal narratives that served as models or teachers for you? Are there some memoirs that you are particularly drawn to?
I know there are. I always have trouble remembering.
Yeah,
I
me
remember
too.
that.
I shouldn't have asked you that.
No, that's okay. By the way, I remember that in my second year at Bard, I think, or third year at Bard, I decided I was going to teach a course called Experiments in Autobiography. And I was going to round up, I had a whole reading list of basically deflections of memory, like, things that, books that involved memory and told whole stories about lives, but did so in a kind of hyper-deflected way. Like there's a book by a Swiss Fluxus artist named Daniel Spüri, where it's called An Anecdotal Topography of Chance. And it begins with a photograph of his breakfast table. And his breakfast table has been visited by dozens of people who've left cigarette packs, and there's, empty bowls of muesli and, just all sorts of crap. And he talks about every single object. And in doing so, he talks about his life and the lives of all the people who surround him. And I thought that was, a very anguished memoir, but it's not about the author, although it is Peter Handke's book about his mother, A Sorrow Beyond Dreams. It was all books like that. And unfortunately, I was such an amateur, and I was just beginning to teach undergraduates after a few years in an MFA program, and I didn't realize that I was going to get all the kids who had big problems in their lives, who were not interested in experiment, they just wanted to get it out.
Yeah.
So that course was just a failure. And thinking about memoir, and the fact is too, there have been like several successive waves of like memoir fever beginning in the 90s. There was a period where I knew like 2 or 3 people who'd written their own memoirs, for example, because, we're a generation of people who were junkies for a few years. I don't know. There's a lot of autobiographical work that I really like.
Well, you made me think about, I'd forgotten this one, but I think it was by Lawrence Sutin. It's called A Postcard Memoir. And it's all of these postcards with photographs on them that I think he collected from junk stores. So, he doesn't know the people in the photographs, but he uses them as a prompt to write his own family stories. Yeah, but it's other people's pictures that he uses. For some reason, that had some influence on me that I'd forgotten until you were talking about not only photography, but those other kinds of exercises. I'm wondering also about both silence that is that speaks volumes because of what we're holding back in a different way than denial. So you write about the denial that plagued you in writing The Factory of Facts. But in this memoir, you were trying very hard to be honest and to tell the truth. And it feels so open because of it. I think that sometimes that might confuse people because it's as if something seems so honest and open and raw, that there's nothing held back, that there's no silences too. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that. I mean, where this comes from for me, as someone who, both as a poet and then, a memoirist, I write autobiographically all the time. And, even when I would just stand up and read poetry, there'd always be, moments where people in the audience would come up to me and say, wow, you just reveal so much. I don't know how you can just reveal so much. And it's always sort of funny to me because I'm thinking, well, yeah, but I've shaped it all in a certain way too. The language is doing something that shapes it. It doesn't reveal everything. It's as if, there's no reservoir of the self that, and you say something about, also the, how do you say it? The arbitrary line between public and private selves. I think I'm trying to ask something about that, but we both knew that neither one of us is good at asking questions. That's why this all sounds like just something I'm thinking. And I'm hoping you can take whatever I just said and run with it.
Totally. Well, the thing is, when I was writing this, I really did. In fact, it just, I'm 5 years into my transition now, and it continues being true that I'm amazed, the sudden, the sudden lightness begins to overset one, which is actually a line that John Berryman wrote about Stephen Crane. The sudden lightness tends to overset one. And for me, it was the lightness of not having any secrets anymore. And that was incredibly liberating. And it's carried on. I'm still a shy person. I still will tend to, head for the farthest couch at any party I go to, but I am not hiding anything. And that's just gravy. And one of the things really, among the reason, possibly my primary reason for writing a book about this, well, I did want to encourage young people and all that kind of stuff. But for me, the intellectual curiosity part had to do with my fascination with my own internal Stasi, this repressive mechanism that kept me, I knew that if I'd grown up today in a culture where the matter of being transgender is something known, I would have known at least by age 9 that I was trans. In any case, there was something that I couldn't name because I thought I was the only person in the world who'd ever experienced this for years. But I had to keep living my life. And so I built in, all these layers of internal surveillance and suppression and denial, and it's really, really intricate. Systems built to, cover up other systems. I had, an entire Central Intelligence Agency in my own head, and that proved to be actually something kind of difficult to write about, because so much of it is fleeting and uncertain, and too many cobwebs in the corners. But the fact is that Yeah, I'm perfectly prepared to reveal everything. You know, I mean, especially at my age, fuck it, I have nothing to lose. You know?
Right.
The only thing is, like, when I reread this now, I think, well, you know, I'm a little disappointed by this book because at the end it makes it feel like everything is so great, and I am fucking depressed. You know, I like talk about how, you know, no longer depressed. I've kept that at bay. It's fine. It's fine. It's great. Nothing to see here. No, I'm really depressed. I'm very, very, very solitary, not by choice, and you know, it bugs me. In a lot of other ways, of course, I'm delighted. I'm delighted to be Lucy. I wish it had started earlier, but what do you want? It's play with the cards you're dealt, and here I am.
I was about to ask you about regret, and which you just addressed at the end of there, but also it's the moment you read from it today too, when you talk about how that denial just sort of poisoned everything.
It did. I know. I mean, it's fascinating now to re-experience. I mean, well, there was a whole big wave of, you know, when I was coming out, and I'd see or talk to whole waves of people, but it keeps happening because I had lunch the day before yesterday with a high school friend who lives in Baltimore, who I hadn't seen in at least 20 years, and it was amazing to be like, I mean, this was a good friend, somebody I really, really, really liked. There was nothing concealed. I mean, I wasn't a secret crush or anything like that. But even so, I was able to experience the full emotional aspect of our friendship for the first time ever. Because those kinds of things, you know, I had to hold my tongue at all times. And there were a lot of things I wish I could have said to people, but I couldn't say them because for one reason or another, those things were stuck behind some kind of wall of silence that I had built.
Well,
One thing I wanted to ask you about your memoir, by the way, is I noticed there's one chapter, I don't know if there's more than one, but I noticed one in particular. It's all written in the second person. And I've been watching, I have the worst TV habits, especially when I'm writing a book, because I have a hard time getting into a whole plot and stuff. So I watch a lot of like true crime TV stuff. You know, and there's this fascinating show called The Devil at Home or The Devil Lives Here or something like that. And it's all people who've had a family member turn toxic, right? And I've been observing how they talk, and they'll say, well, yeah, I did this and I did that. But when it comes to the really hard part, they say, you know, you walk into that room and then you think, they slip into the second person. And was that like conscious when you did that?
yes, I think when I first wrote that chapter, I wrote it from the first person. But then, you know, the more I looked at it, the more I thought that, you know, to really sort of enact, have the language enact that sort of feeling of being separated from the self because of trauma, that I needed to say it in the second person. And, you know, I think the chapter ends with something like, you know, look at you. Even now you think you can distance yourself from that girl you were, right in the second person, as if you weren't the one to whom any of this happened. And that's exactly, you know, what I was hoping that it would show that kind of split. And then I felt like I backed myself into a corner once I was writing in the second person and I had to get out of it.
Right.
So the next chapter is called Dear Diary, and it is about how writing allowed me to kind of reclaim the self and to be I again. Yeah. I'm also thinking about sometimes, I mean, I don't think I think about this when I'm writing, but managing readers' expectations. And, you know, because Memorial Drive is a memoir that has, I suppose, at its heart, a trauma. It's interesting to me how many people are interested in prurient details, I mean, so this goes back to sort of situation and story, and what character I was going to be. So, the subtitle of Memorial Drive is A Daughter's Memoir. And I made that the subtitle because I really wanted to make sure that people understood that the focus was this memoir about my relationship with my mother, and from that lens of a daughter. But there are people that will say to me, yeah, well, I wanted to know what happened to your brother, or I wanted to know what happened to your father. And I'm like, that's not that memoir. This is not what that's about.
Yeah.
And so it is something about, you're trying, to write to tell this particular story, but that people just, because of, certain kinds of details, want to know this other stuff. I don't know what I'm saying about this, except it actually sometimes annoys me. I mean, those of you who've given a reading, I mean, like, you give a reading of a book of poems that's, a lot about your mother, and someone will come up to you and afterwards and say, well, you write all these poems about your mother. Do you ever write about your father? I'm like, well, go read that other book, because I did that too. But it is just a different lens, each time. And, I'm trying to write another memoir right now. And my editor told me that once I turned in, and this one is about my father, it does also cover a lot of the same period, of my life, the way that
Yeah.
dealt with. I don't know.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Well, she said that she would go back and read Memorial Drive once I finished this and give it to her, I guess, to see, I don't know, if I've repeated myself, or, I mean, the experience is still the experience, but you find new ways to write about it.
It's a kind of Rashomon thing too, in a way. It's not a different story. It's just different perspectives.
Just a different perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gosh, I was going to say something. I can't remember what it was now. Anyway.
Okay, let's see. I just want to read something that I love from the end of The Factory of Facts.
Oh, I just want to, I remembered what I was going to say, by the way, which is that one tremendous gift that transitioning gave me was it gave me a lens through which to look at my life, because, this represents a condensed version of my life. It leaves out a lot. And I wonder, like, well, how did I get to talking about this thing, which is but it's actually like looking at my life with the lens of transition. Certain things stood out, and those were all the things that made it into the book. And there's things that are in other ways are just as important to my life that don't make it into the book because they were not involved in this mechanism of denial.
Right. I mean, and again, that is about, it's the same life, but what details you choose become the story that you're telling.
Right.
And, I think all the time about how someone else telling the story of my life might pick out very different details. And, there's a moment in Memorial Drive that I quote Orson Welles saying, if you want a happy ending, it depends on where you stop your story.
Yes.
And the reason that I wrote Memorial Drive was that I was really tired of parts of my story being told for me or about me. If someone wrote a newspaper article about me, the facts of my trauma of losing my mother. You know, my mother was murdered when I was 19. She would be mentioned as an afterthought, just sort of this murdered woman, and was sort of being written out of the story of me becoming a writer. That's what made me decide to write it.
Oh, yeah.
Because, and I think now, you know, there's moments where, and this goes back to the sort of poisoned thing and regret. You know, I think people are certainly well-meaning, but after a reading, sometimes people will come up and say, I would not want to have your life. And it is a terrible thing when someone says that.
Yeah.
Because it's filled with this kind of pity. And it also assumes, and I think sometimes they say this too, your life was ruined. And I don't feel like my life was ruined.
No.
The thought of like that I'm sitting here living inside of a ruined life, that would be depressing.
Yeah.
You know, I think the writer Aminata Forna has talked a lot about this, that, you know, having gone through, you know, a war, you know, people will come and say, oh, your life was destroyed, your life was ruined. And you're supposed to sort of go on thinking, you know, how do I exist inside of a ruined life? But it doesn't feel like that at all.
Yeah, yeah. For some reason, I just remembered something very weird that James M. Cain, who wrote Double Indemnity, The Postman Always Rings Twice, he wrote, nobody should write their autobiography unless it could be subtitled, Or Up From Slavery.
I like that. Yeah. Oh.
I mean, you know, that's the thing about memoir, too, is that I took a class in college on autobiography in the 19th century, and it, you know, all these, basically like a lot of Victorian beardos with serious father issues, Edmund Goss, Carlyle, you know, all these people. And for a long time, it was assumed that, you know, memoir, what does this mean, this memoir thing? Well, there's autobiography, and you write an autobiography if you're like retired from a lifetime of successful military campaigns. You know, no, you know, you just had an ordinary life. You went to the supermarket. You like occasionally fell asleep in front of the TV, and you're going to write an autobiography. You know.
You know, sort of going back to what I was saying about, you know, those kinds of things that, you know, that people would say. I remember telling, I think my agent at some point, that if I were presented with, if someone said, you know, do you wish that never happened? You know, do you wish that your mother were still alive? And it's not a simple yes or no answer, because I'm not who I am without her death.
Yeah, yeah.
And I actually like the life I have, but it is predicated on a tremendous loss.
Yeah.
And I don't exist without it.
Yeah.
I don't know who I'd be.
I know.
And I wouldn't want it.
Right, right.
So, do you feel that way about, can the regret also have also shaped you in a way that, or do you simply, I mean, you did say that you wish you had done this sooner. There's a life you would have had that would be totally different if you'd done it sooner.
Yeah. I mean, you know, and if I ever do a PSA, it will be like, parents, if your kid says they're transgender, believe them, because it's not it's not a choice. Yeah. It's not a choice, and it's something that essentially your body tells you, like or something in you tells you, and and even if you're 4 years old, when you have a headache. Well, this is the same kind of thing, you know. Yeah, of course, I wish I'd been able to have that life, but I doubt I'd be, if I, I mean, you have to imagine a whole different universe where I could have, changed my gender when I was, in my teens, which was pretty much unheard of. I do know someone my age who did that because they had a medically connected family, and they haven't had a life I envy, believe me. Yeah, I mean, my time in the trenches, the trenches of denial and the trenches of self-doubt, of trying to fit in, of trying to re-engineer myself, helped form me as a human and as a writer, and, that's an education I wouldn't have had. And as I write in the book, I imagine what it would have been like being my parents' daughter. And it was difficult enough being their son. If I'd been their daughter, they would have kept me under lock and key until I was 26. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you have lived the life that you have.
Thank you.
And I'm glad that we had you here to talk about it.
And what a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Lucy.